There is a photograph that almost nobody has seen. In it, a small boy sits on the edge of a bed in Rosario, Argentina. He is 8 years old. His shorts are pulled down to his knee. In his hand is a syringe. His face shows no expression at all. Not fear, not sadness. Just the flat, practiced calm of someone who has already done this 100 times before and knows he will do it 1,000 times more. This is not a photograph of an athlete. This is a photograph of a patient. Before the world knew him as a magician with a ball at his feet, Lionel Messi was something else entirely. He was a diagnosis, a file in a doctor's office, a child whose own body seemed to have made a decision without asking him, and long before anyone chanted his name in a stadium, Lionel Messi was fighting a war that had nothing to do with football at all. He was fighting to simply grow. Pause. Tonight, we are not going to talk about goals. We are going to talk about the year a boy learned that his own body could betray him and what he chose to do about it. The boy who stopped growing Rosario is not a glamorous place. It is a river city in Argentina, built on grain and steel, a city of narrow streets and modest homes. It is the kind of place where football is not a hobby. It is oxygen. Every boy in every street plays. Every family has an opinion about who is good and who is not. In one of those streets lived a family named Messi. The father, Jorge, worked at a steel factory. The mother, Celia, worked at a magnet manufacturing plant. They had 3 sons before Lionel arrived. And by the time he could walk, it was already clear inside the family that something about this 4th child was different. He would follow his older brothers to the local club, Grandoli, barely old enough to hold a ball properly, and refused to leave the field even when the older boys pushed him aside. He was 5 years old, and he was already smaller than every other child around him. At first, no one worried. Small children grow at different speeds. But the years went on, and the gap did not close. It widened. By the time Lionel turned 8, his growth had almost completely stopped. Other boys his age had begun to stretch upward, their voices beginning to change, their shoulders beginning to broaden. Lionel remained the same size he had been 2 years earlier. He looked, his teammates would later recall, like a much younger child standing among them. His parents took him to a doctor. The diagnosis came back with a long, clinical name, growth hormone deficiency. In simple terms, Lionel's pituitary gland was not producing enough of the hormone that tells a child's body to grow. Left untreated, doctors told the family their son might reach an adult height of no more than 5 feet tall, maybe less size. Try to imagine what that sentence means to a 9-year-old boy who wants nothing in the world except to play football. Not, you might be short. A verdict, a number on a page, delivered by a stranger in a white coat, describing a body that had not yet finished happening to him. There was a treatment. It existed, but it came with a condition attached like a blade. The price of a centimeter. The treatment required daily injections of synthetic growth hormone, not weekly, not monthly, daily. Every single night, for years, a needle had to go into the boy's leg. And the treatment was expensive, extraordinarily expensive. The Messi family's health insurance in Argentina covered part of the cost, but only part. The full expense ran into hundreds of dollars a month, an almost impossible number for a steel worker's household in a country that was, at that exact moment in history, sliding toward one of the worst economic collapses in its history. Argentina in the late 1990s was not a stable place to raise a sick child. Inflation was rising, jobs were disappearing, and here was a family being told that if they wanted their son's body to have any chance at a normal life, let alone the life of a professional athlete, they needed to find money that simply did not exist. For a while, the local football club, Newell's Old Boys, where Lionel had transferred and quickly become the best player anyone there had ever seen, agreed to help cover part of the treatment. It was not charity, out of the goodness of anyone's heart. Everyone at that club could already see it. This child was not ordinary. On the field, whatever his body could not do standing still, it could do at devastating speed with a ball attached to his foot. Coaches would later describe watching him as a boy and feeling an odd, dizzy sensation as if they were watching something that should not have been possible. But even Newell's, a modest club in a modest league, could not sustain the cost forever. Eventually, the money ran out. The club stopped paying. And so, every night, in a small house in Rosario, a routine began that had nothing romantic about it at all. Celia, his mother, or sometimes Jorge, his father, would prepare the syringe. Lionel would sit still. The needle would go into his thigh. He would wince just slightly, the way any child does, and then it would be over until the next night, when it would happen again. He did this for years, not once, not as a phase. Years clears throat. Here is something almost no interview, no documentary, no highlight reel will ever properly show you. While the rest of the football world was watching other children learn tricks with a ball in a park, Lionel Messi was learning something else. He was learning what it feels like to need something from his own body that his own body refused to give freely. He was learning, at an age when most children haven't yet learned to tie their own shoes properly, that some things you want most in life will cost you pain, delivered on a schedule, without exception, without a day off. Smaller than everyone, faster than anyone on the field, the effect of his condition was impossible to hide. At 9, at 10, at 11 years old, Lionel stood a full head shorter than most of his teammates and opponents. Photographs from that era show him standing in team lines, looking almost like a mascot who had wandered in among older boys. Opposing coaches, seeing him warm up before a match, sometimes assumed there had been a mistake. Surely this tiny child was not meant to be on this pitch. Surely he belonged in a younger age group. Then the whistle would blow, and the boy who could not stand still through class, who looked lost among his own teammates, before kickoff would become something else entirely. He moved low to the ground. His center of gravity, built for turns no taller boy could make, he slipped between legs that seemed impossibly far apart to him, but were, for him, simply doorways. He scored constantly, goals in the dozens, in single seasons, at youth tournaments across Argentina. There is a story, often repeated in Rosario, of a match where he scored so many goals that the opposing parents in the stands began to laugh, not out of mockery, but out of disbelief. The way people laugh when they see a magic trick they cannot explain. But here is the part of the story that gets lost when people only remember the goals. Every one of those matches, every one of those seasons, was being played by a boy whose own doctors had told his family he might never reach a normal adult height. Every sprint down the wing, every impossible turn, was happening inside a body that his family was fighting night after night with a needle to keep from falling further behind. He was not just outplaying children, he was outplaying his own diagnosis. A father's impossible math. If this story has a second protagonist, it is Jorge Messi, a steelworker, not a wealthy man, not a man with easy answers. Jorge watched his son's talent grow more undeniable by the month, and at the same time, watched the cost of keeping that son's body functioning grow more unaffordable by the month. He was doing an impossible kind of math in his head, the kind of math no parent should have to do. How do you calculate the value of your child's health against a bill you cannot pay? By the time Lionel was 11, in the year 1998 and into 1999, the family's situation had become genuinely desperate. Newell's could no longer help. Argentina's other major clubs, including the giant of Argentine football, River Plate, were reportedly interested in the boy's talent, but unwilling to commit to the medical costs attached to him. Word had spread. Everyone wanted the player. Almost no one wanted the patient. Sighs. Think about that for a moment, my friend. A boy is offered admiration for his gift and rejection for his body, sometimes by the very same institutions, sometimes within the same conversation. Scouts would watch him destroy older boys on a football pitch, and then, in a back office, quietly decide the medical bill made him too complicated to sign. It is a strange kind of cruelty dressed up as a business decision. The family had relatives in Catalonia, in Spain. A distant connection eventually opened a door that Argentina had, in effect, closed. FC Barcelona's youth scouts had heard about the boy. A trial was arranged. In September of 2000, Jorge took his 13-year-old son across the ocean, away from Rosario, away from the only streets Lionel had ever known, for a tryout that would either change everything or change nothing. The napkin, what happened next, has become one of football's most repeated legends. But it is worth slowing down on, because underneath the legend is the same story we have been telling all along, a story about a body that needed proof before anyone would commit to it. The trial went well. Barcelona's youth coaches were stunned by what they saw, but the club's directors hesitated, signing a 13-year-old boy from another continent, one who required an extremely expensive daily medical treatment, was not a simple decision. Weeks passed. Jorge and Lionel sat in Barcelona in a kind of suspended limbo, waiting for an answer that did not come. Jorge began preparing to take his son home. If Barcelona would not commit, there was no reason to stay in a foreign country, running out of savings, chasing a dream that seemed to be slipping away exactly the way it had in Argentina. Then, in December of 2000, Barcelona's technical director, a man named Carlos Rexach, decided he could not risk losing the boy to another club while the paperwork dragged on. The story goes that Rexach, unable to find formal contract paper in the moment, wrote the terms of an agreement on a paper napkin at a restaurant table and had it signed on the spot. It is a charming detail, the kind that makes for a good headline. But look past the charm for a moment. That napkin existed because of urgency, and the urgency existed because everyone involved understood the same brutal fact. This boy's body was expensive, his time was limited, and if Barcelona did not act immediately, someone else would take the risk instead. The napkin promised something specific. It promised that Barcelona would pay for Lionel's medical treatment. For the first time since his diagnosis, years after the nightly injections had begun, a boy's health had finally become someone else's obligation to solve, rather than his family's alone. leaving everything to keep growing. The cost of that promise was enormous, and it had nothing to do with money. To access that treatment, to give his body the chance the diagnosis had threatened to take away. 13-year-old Lionel had to leave Rosario, leave his cousins, leave his friends, leave the streets where he had learned every trick that had made him remarkable in the first place. His mother and siblings initially stayed behind in Argentina while his father brought him to Spain. For a period of time, it was just Jorge and Lionel alone together in a foreign city, in a country where the accent was familiar, but the world was not. Teammates and coaches at Barcelona's academy, La Masia, would later describe the young Messi during this period as painfully quiet. He barely spoke to anyone for months. He was homesick in a way that went beyond ordinary homesickness. He had been uprooted from the only home he had ever known, specifically and only because his own body required a treatment his home country could not, or would not, afford to give him. Here is the quiet tragedy underneath the eventual triumph. Every night, in his new bed in a new country, a needle still went into his leg. The routine that had defined his childhood in Rosario had simply followed him across an ocean. Nothing about the actual treatment had changed. What had changed was where he had to be in order to receive it. He was not chasing a dream to Barcelona so much as he was chasing his own height. The football was the reason the world was watching. The syringe was the reason he had come at all. The body that finally answered. The treatment worked. Slowly, over the following years, Lionel Messi began to grow, not dramatically, not into a tall man by any measure. He would eventually stand at 5 feet 7 inches, still shorter than most professional athletes, still smaller than nearly every defender who would spend the next 2 decades trying and failing to knock the ball off his feet. But he grew enough to develop into an athlete capable of surviving and then dominating the most physically demanding sport on the planet. The daily injections eventually stopped. Once his growth had stabilized in his mid-teens, the needle that had marked every night of his childhood simply disappeared from his life. The way a difficult chapter sometimes ends not with a dramatic final scene, but with a quiet last page nobody marks on a calendar. What did not disappear was what the years of that treatment had built inside him. Think about what it does to a child to be told, essentially, that his body has a defect that requires nightly correction. Think about what it does to grow up smaller than everyone around him in a sport that is supposed to reward size and strength, and to be forced over and over to find another way to survive. Think about learning, before the age of 10, that adults in positions of power will sometimes see your talent and still walk away because your body is too complicated, too expensive, too much of a risk. Those lessons do not vanish simply because the syringes stop. The silence he carried onto every pitch. Anyone who has watched Lionel Messi play football for the last 2 decades has likely noticed something particular about him. He does not celebrate the way other great players do. He rarely shouts. He rarely poses for the cameras with wide, performative joy. Even after scoring goals that will be replayed for 100 years, his most common reaction is something quieter: a raised finger to the sky, a brief embrace, a return to his own half of the field, with his head slightly down. Commentators over the years have called this humility. Others have called it shyness. Both are true in their way. But there is a third explanation buried underneath, one that connects directly back to a boy sitting on the edge of a bed in Rosario with a syringe in his hand. A child who spends years learning that his body requires constant, quiet management does not grow into an adult who performs. He grows into an adult who endures. The nightly injections were never public. There was no audience for that pain, no crowd to perform for, no highlight reel. It was simply a private, repeated act of discipline that had to happen whether anyone was watching or not. That is, in many ways, the exact temperament people still describe when they talk about Messi on a football field. Understated, relentless, somehow both fragile and unbreakable at once. A player who has scored more goals than almost anyone in the history of the sport, and who still, after each one, tends to look less like a man celebrating a victory and more like a man quietly confirming that the work was done correctly. Bosom. Perhaps that is what happens when your first great victory in life was never a trophy at all. It was simply waking up the next morning a little taller than the day before. What the diagnosis never understood. There is a cruel irony sitting at the center of this entire story, and it deserves to be said plainly. The very condition that once threatened to end Lionel Messi's football career before it began, his small stature, the years of treatment, the low center of gravity that resulted from a body forced to grow slowly and carefully, became, in the end, one of the defining physical advantages of his playing style. His low balance, his ability to change direction faster than defenders, built twice his size, his impossibly close control of the ball, developed in part because, for years, he was simply too small to rely on strength or speed the way other boys could. The very thing his doctors called a deficiency became, on a football pitch, something closer to a design. No one intended this. There is no secret plan hidden in a medical file that says, this treatment will one day create the greatest dribbler football has ever seen. It is simply what sometimes happens when a person is forced, early and painfully, to build an entirely different set of tools than the ones the world expects them to use. Doctors saw a boy who might not reach 5 feet tall. Clubs in Argentina saw a financial liability wrapped around undeniable talent. A napkin in a Barcelona restaurant saw an opportunity too good to lose to hesitation. None of them, not one, saw the actual truth clearly enough to say it out loud. That this particular body, small and stubborn, and quietly rebuilt night after night with a needle, was not a problem to be solved. It was simply waiting to become exactly what it needed to be. The boy in the photograph returned, for a moment, to where we began. The boy on the edge of the bed, the syringe in his small hand, the flat, practiced calm on his face. That boy did not know, in that moment, what any of it would become. He did not know about a napkin waiting for him years later in a Spanish restaurant. He did not know about a stadium in New Jersey, or a trophy lifted under the lights of Qatar, or a number, 900 goals, that only one other man in the history of the sport would ever reach. He knew only the needle and the wince and the promise, repeated to him more times than any child should have to hear it, that this was necessary, that this was for him, that this would help him grow. He believed it. Night after night, he believed it, because there was very little else a child in his position could do, except believe. And so tonight, when you watch the highlight reels, the impossible turns, the goals that seem to defy geometry, the trophies raised above his head, Remember that none of it started on a football pitch. It started in a bedroom in Rosario with a boy who was told his body might fail him and who decided, quietly, without any audience at all, that he would not let it. The football world remembers Lionel Messi as a genius with a ball at his feet. But before any of that, he was something far more ordinary and far more remarkable. He was a child who kept showing up for the needle every single night without complaint, because somewhere inside him, even at 8 years old, some part of him had already decided that he was going to grow into whatever he was meant to become, no matter what it cost and no matter how long it took. That is not a story about football. That is a story about what it costs to become yourself. And perhaps, my friend, that is the real reason this small boy from Rosario grew into someone the entire world now watches in silence, holding its breath every single time the ball touches his feet.